Biden. But the fact of the matter is, you look at the national polling, the generic congressional ballot choice for U.S. House. Look at this. CNN poll, +2 Republican. Wall Street Journal poll, +3 Republican. Monmouth University poll, +3 Republican. Yeah, Joe Biden may be in slightly worse shape in these particular polls, but the fact is when Biden's down 4, 5, 6 points in these polls, you can only run so far ahead of Joe Biden. At this particular point, at least in the race for the House, it does seem like Republicans are ahead because Donald Trump is so far ahead.
What's the Senate landscape?
Yeah, what's the Senate landscape? I mean, take a look here. GOP needs just a gain of 1 for control if Trump wins, and their path is extremely clear because their best chance for a pickup opportunity is in West Virginia. That's a very likely GOP win with Joe Manchin retiring. And the best Dem pickup chance, perhaps to reverse that so the GOP doesn't gain a net gain of at least 1, is Texas. But that's still a likely GOP win. So the fact is, if Donald Trump wins this election, the race for the Senate, for all intents and purposes in my mind, is over.
One of the things I have heard from Democrats running for Congress is, okay, if President Biden's not doing well, what we'll say is it makes it all that much more important to elect a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. Maybe they can gain support that way. But does it work like that, split tickets anymore?
It really doesn't. Let's go back since 2000. Same party won presidency and Congress. Yes. 5 times. No was just 1 time in 2012, the House that year. But the House popular vote that year actually went Democratic, even though Republicans maintained control of the House. So the fact is 5 out of 6 times, that's not good math. And let's just take a look at the Senate here. Senate and presidential races in 2016 and 2020. States that voted the same way in both, 68. States that voted for a different party, just 1. That was Maine back in 2020. The fact is, straight ticket voting is the way of the land these days. The idea that Democrats down ballot could somehow outrun Joe Biden to such a great extent to win control in the House or maintain control in the Senate, that seems to me to be an unlikely proposition.
That is a pretty stark number.
Yeah,
right?
those are pretty clear numbers, John.
Harry, thank you very much.
Welcome, friends. Left Reckoning 177. Biden's Bumbles, the Brexit betrayal, and some hope in Iran. My name is David Griscom, and I'm broadcasting to y'all from Austin, Texas. Joined as always by my good friend Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing,
You enjoying watching the decline?
Let's see, how am I doing? Actually, let me show you in a Kevin Durant quote. I feel like this. Kevin Durant, let me die out there. This is where Joe Biden's at. Don't take me out. Let me die out there, because he loves the game so much.
He does love the game.
He's
so
the
much.
Kevin Durant of politics is Joe Biden.
You know, it reminds me of something that Willie Nelson, and somebody who I love very much, and have been lucky to see play many, many times. I saw him somewhat recently, and while it was still amazing, I had that kind of moment where it's like, oh man, is this kind of cruel, wrong, to have him out there. And if I didn't know that Willie said that he wants to, go out on stage, I would think that somebody's trying to take advantage of him. It's pretty wild to see Biden in a less glorious and interesting and exciting way, basically do something similar to much less amusement for the rest of us. It's dire, man. I mean, just a quick preview. In a little bit, we're going to be talking with Philip Cunliffe about what happened in the United Kingdom's elections over the weekend, and as well as a conversation with Seamus about what's going on in Iran. We might not be able to get to it, might talk about in the postgame what happened in France, but it's been kind of an interesting past couple of weeks politically, where you have seen, if not, things to be excited about, at least kind of avoidance of some of the worst possible options out there. In the U.S., I mean, we really are playing through one of the most depressing kind of political timelines here. Yeah. And I mean, we have a lot to get to. We have some sound stuff we're going to talk to, at the very front, but it really is just amazing to me out of all the conversations that I've had with folks recently, both, in our world, Matt, and also just like friends and folks at barbecues and things like that over the weekend. I mean, everybody is just sort of resigned for the worst possible option at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting. My family, who occasionally likes to discuss politics with me, and who have moved from vaguely like Bush conservatives to like independent, but with like lefty ideas, whatever, right? Like
Hmm.
too depressed to talk about it. Don't want to bring it up. It's just it's obscene, and that is, I think Osido Wanevu has written eloquently about this, like. I've kind of gone back and forth because I had lamented, when my freshman year of college, Obama was elected president, and I remember taunting the McCain voters on campus. I remember the feeling of like, yeah, we're like turning this stuff back. I mean, and like I felt like this is a country where no black person has been president before. We got a black president, and he opposed the Iraq War, and that was very exciting, but it was a false, I think, a representation of the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi said she knew that Bush was lying about Iraq, but still supported the war anyway, right? Like those things were illusions. And maybe it's not so bad that we can sort of we are hitting a rock bottom point. This is like it's not as bloody as 1968.
Hmm.
But when Nixon won, people were so shocked because they thought, like, how could this guy win? How like surely America won't vote for that guy. And it happened once in 2016, and it looks very, very much. And I don't make predictions. I've seen too many elections go ways that I didn't expect, even based on polling. But it don't look good at all
I
for our
mean,
boy Joe Brandon.
I mean, it'd be exceptionally, surprising and shocking, even if Joe Biden, hell makes it to the presidential election, let alone wins it. And I mean, we have.
Maybe he's got some planned though. I mean, Supreme Court did just legalize some pretty wide latitude measures. Maybe he is going to assassinate Donald Trump before the election, and that's, I think, probably his best chance of beating him.
Look, I mean, ideologically, politically, the Democratic Party has never really offered any path forward, path to the future, right? Um, but what we're seeing with folks like Joe Biden, with people like Senator Feinstein, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all these kind of figures, sort of clinging to power till the very, very bitter end. What you're seeing is not just a party that's out of ideas, out of um, energy. You're seeing a party implode upon itself because it doesn't even have the capacity to function as a political party that is just sort of sitting on the top of empire. What you are seeing right now is a political party that doesn't even understand its reason for being, and its reason for being has always been to serve the interests of the rich and powerful, maintain influence for a certain part of the ruling class in America, and from time to time maybe whip up some excitement from everyday folks who think that this election is really going to be the one that makes a difference. What you're seeing right now, I mean, is pure delusion. And to see this kind of crumbling political party be exposed for the fraud and the sham that it is, you wish you could find a little bit of joy in it. I'm trying my very best. But what you find more and more is a very frightening realization that there isn't really even anybody at the top of this very, very barbaric system.
No, and my concern now is that this travesty that we're watching play out doesn't harm, say, state level Democrats that, for instance, pass a minimum wage for Uber drivers in Minnesota and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Like, and I don't like. So, for instance, I don't know if we want to move now to like the squad stuff. I think it was Cory Bush who came out and supported Joe. And she's currently in a primary with a GOP campaign, a former GOP campaign operative, pretending to be a Democrat.
Mhm.
And what's scaring a lot of them, and I don't think this is an excuse for AOC as much as maybe Bush, is what happened to Bowman, which is that Bowman withheld his vote on Build Back Better, which was not Build Back Better, sorry, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, because it wasn't Build Back Better. And that was all over the ads saying he doesn't support Joe Biden enough. Now, I frankly think that it wasn't that. I think they put a bunch of rich people into his district and moved a lot of not rich people out of it. Mm-hmm. And that's why he lost to Latimer. But that's what has the squad very scared at this point. And frankly, I think that is a failure, because I think Joe is going down, and I think tying your fortunes to his, I think is actually its own risk.
It's exceptionally damaging. Let's play this. This is AOC speaking about Joe Biden recently.
Has spoken to the president over the weekend. I have spoken with him extensively. He made clear then, and he has made clear since, that he is in this race. The matter is closed. He had reiterated that this morning. He has reiterated that to the public. Joe Biden is our nominee. He is not leaving this race. He is in this race, and I support him. Now, what I think is critically important right now is that we focus on what it takes to win in November, because he is running against Donald Trump, who is a man with 34 felony convictions that has committed 34 felony crimes, and not a single Republican has asked for Donald Trump to not be the nominee. I'm here to win on this democracy. I'm here to win in November. And what's critically important is what I believe that the president needs to do, and I have communicated this, what the president and the White House should do in order to make sure that we win in November. And that is making sure that we pivot and working and increasingly commit to the issues that are critically important to working people across this country. How are we going to expand Medicare? How are we going to expand Social Security? How are we going to provide relief to people's rent and mortgages? And if we can do that and continue our work on student loans, secure a ceasefire, and bring those dollars back into investing in public policy, then that's how we win in November. That's what I'm committed to, and that's what I want to make sure that we see.
Just really quick, because the policy stuff we get to at the end there. Let's just note one thing really fast. Do you know why you don't hear Republicans asking for Donald Trump to step down? It's because Donald Trump continues to win and poll higher than Joe Biden. And then Joe Biden went and spaced out in front of the country, exposed something that a lot of people have been whispering and talking about for a long while, which is that Joe Biden does not have a conception of where he is or what's going on a lot of the time. And now those numbers that were already bad, that were putting him in second place and losing to Donald Trump, are worse. That's why we are having a different kind of conversation between those parties, right? Now, the second thing, Matt, I'd love to hear you chime in here, but it's also completely bizarre, frankly, to sit here and talk about return the conversation to this kind of stuff. Joe Biden has been president for 4 years, and we have seen him turn his back on every single one of those kind of things. We're seeing, some of the more significant things that he has been doing is trying to mirror and ape Donald Trump at the U.S. border, a place where AOC herself went and was horrified of what the United States was doing to migrants. And now we're seeing Joe Biden maintain, continue, and expand those kind of policies. That's a joke. We're also seeing Joe Biden, one of the fundamental moral issues of our time, pour gasoline on a genocide and run cover for a maniac state of Israel. It's ridiculous to sit here and talk like that. Yeah, it would be great if there was a candidate who is running for president right now who was talking about things like lowering people's rents, coming after corporate America, increasing protections for working class folks, and talking about those real bread and butter issues. You know who's not doing that? Joe Biden. Do you know who wasn't doing that 2 years ago? Joe Biden. And do you know what party does not represent that kind of movement? The Democratic Party at this point, because those are bread and butter issues, things that we should be having more conversations about. But what Joe Biden and the Biden family have made this party about, and now what all of the Democratic Party's enablers, and let's talk a little bit more about the squad in a second, all of the enablers have also made this election about, is not about the American people, the future of the country. It's about Joe Biden's personal damn feelings and his career, and this absurd idea that the rest of the country can be subjected to whatever if it helps the Biden family feel good about themselves. And, and Joe Biden can feel nice about doing the, quote, goodest job.
The 34 felonies thing is weak as fuck. I'm sorry.
Such a stinker.
Maybe to the American electorate, which, locks up people at like no other country on this earth, maybe that'll play. I don't know. Joe Biden is arming the death of over 100,000 Palestinians by a conservative estimate by the Lancet magazine. It is true. I will credit her for this. If Joe Biden not asked for a ceasefire, not desired a ceasefire, as Matt Duss said, but imposed one on Israel, then I would be backing off of this, get Biden off the ticket, he can't do anything. Because there's all this talk about, like, how can he prove himself? This big boy press conference. What is he going to do? Like, maybe he's going to go on the campaign trail, do a cartwheel. No, stop the fucking genocide you're doing if you want to look active. Very simple. 2 birds with 1 stone. But he's not going to do that because he's giving Israel carte blanche. And, like, that's the other thing is, like, this party, when the State Department looks at other countries and is like, wow, that country, look at that regime, they're having trouble passing on power. It's because there's skeletons in the closet. Yeah, that's another thing that's going on here too. It's because Kamala Harris don't want the problem of Israel-Palestine that's active right now either. Like she probably ain't chomping for the bit. If she was, maybe things might be a little bit different. I don't know. I don't know if she has that kind of pull, frankly. But like, this is. But instead, like, we're all of a sudden supposed to talk about fascism. Well, Jamal Bowman just lost a primary to a guy. And he was attacked because he wanted your full agenda that you ran on in 2020, Joe. And I don't know. I'm kind of losing my train of thought. But it's like that maybe if it's fascism, we don't sever our agenda and then attack people who apologize. Because the Autobahn was bipartisan originally too.
But there's no agenda here. And I think that fundamentally, when you see somebody like AOC saying what they're saying, there's a bit of resignation at the beginning of that quote. And they're all sort of saying, oh, he's not backing down. This is like the complaint. And it's probably going to be the excuse that folks will make after. It's like, well, we tried really hard privately, back channel, to have conversations with Joe Biden. He wouldn't back down. Well, if Joe Biden, if all the things that y'all say are true, that this is the most important election of our lifetime, fascism is at the gates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and you didn't want to publicly say, hey, this guy's going to fuck it up for all of us. We need to put some pressure on them to do what's right and what's strategically correct to do. Then what are we doing here? What are we talking about when we hear these like big, odes to the importance of preserving democracy? It's frankly, it's bullshit because
loyalty.
It's loyalty, and loyalty to what? It's not even loyalty to the fucking Democratic Party as like an institution. It's like loyalty to the Biden administration and the few folks who I guess have his ear. And what you're seeing.
Yeah. Sorry. Just the loyalty would have been nice when Bowman was getting primaried. If you want to show loyalty to the squad, like how about an advance payment on that shit not wait until after a miracle election.
And here's the fundamental reality. It's something that Matt, since we've launched Left Reckoning, we've been talking about this. The relationship that like a kind of working class movement, socialist movement, whatever you want to call it, the U.S. should have to the squad. I mean, this is a moment where it's very much exposed. The fact that you don't have these members, these progressive bloc, we don't even have to call them socialists anymore. We can just call them progressives, right? Are seeing an ancient figure in Joe Biden literally sleepwalking into a disaster for us, not for him. He's be gone, right? Making the world a worse place, a more unstable place. Watching that happen and not saying, hey, this is a time for me to speak to the American people. There's a different way of doing politics. Hey, all that stuff AOC said there was pretty nice, right? Yeah, we should be talking about bread and butter issues. We should be talking about the working class. We should be talking about lowering rents. We should be talking about a ceasefire in Gaza, right? This would be the opportunity to say, hey, you know what? There's a difference between there is a different model than just, hey, nasty, bloated billionaire on the right, miserable, corrupt political family on the left, and just see who wins those conflicts. No, there should be a path forward for a kind of working class movement that takes all these kind of things on. And our movement represents that. No, but we don't get that from them. Instead, they want to be the fucking protectors of the corrupt Democratic Party that they all ran against when they got elected. They all ran against the quote establishment. They all ran against the machine. They said power to the people, grassroots, all this kind of stuff. And then they get into power. And not only do they not sit here and make a clear distinction between the Democratic Party, its leadership, and its failings that's harming people in this country and all across the globe, they don't make that distinction. They actually trip over themselves to be more staunch defenders of that system than even fucking miserable, moderate, centrist, weak Democrats. It's unbelievable.
By the thing of her saying that she's spoken at length to Biden and said all those good things that we should be saying to him if we had his attention. Biden's not saying any of that shit. To the extent Biden's coherent, and they're saying, why should he be president? He's saying NATO and keeping China down.
Yeah. No, yeah.
I'm not interested in that.
It's war. It's like Joe Biden's like the most important things for our future is maintaining and protecting American empire and spreading war. And he's even bad at that though, Matt. I mean, this was just a truly amazing story. And this is not the kind of press you want at a moment like this. It's from Business Insider. Biden didn't show up for an early evening meeting with the German chancellor because he had to go to bed. I'm not kidding. This is Business Insider. President Joe Biden canceled an early evening meeting with the German chancellor Olaf Scholz at the last minute because he had to go to bed, according to a report by the Wall Street Journal. The newspaper reported that the event was an informal gathering in Germany amid the G7 summit in June 2022 and was meant to be a low-key meeting to discuss Ukraine. So even on the metric that these freaks are putting forward, he fails. And the response that we're going to get from them, Matt, and what the people who are trying to do spin, I mean, the AOC thing that she just did, that appeals to zero people, except for maybe Joe Biden and their team, if they're even awake or listening.
He remembers it.
Yeah.
If it's between 11 a.m. and 6 p.m., maybe he'll remember it.
And sometimes you got to think about who you are in a room with, right? And again, it's very, I think, pathetic that we're seeing this supposedly progressive bloc, the left wing of the Democratic Party, et cetera, surrounding themselves with some of the most incompetent people. We're not even just talking about the Biden administration. We're talking about his most staunch defenders. Here's Ted Lieu, who is just like a Twitter comment reply guy brought to life. This is his kind of response to the serious questions, by the way, about whether or not Joe Biden has the mental capacity to sit at such a critical position in the American system. This is his response here.
So like Chairman Aguilar said, we hear a lot from our constituents on different issues, but something I've heard that doesn't seem to be being covered are the Epstein files. These files were released, and like Donald Trump sort of all over this, right? There are pictures of him with Jeffrey Epstein. He's taken multiple plane flights with Epstein with young girls on board. He is on call logs with Epstein. One of the highest trending hashtags on Twitter right now is about Trump and Epstein. I'm not going to repeat the hashtag because we're in a dignified setting. But yeah, y'all might want to look at that because that's highly disturbing. And again, it shows that Donald Trump is unfit for office. And by the way, he was convicted in a civilian court for sexual assault, convicted in a separate court of 34 felonies. Donald Trump should drop out of the race.
Big win. Matt, is the media not covering Donald Trump and his many scandals?
I mean, the Epstein stuff, it's funny. I first heard of this in 2008. I remember being in the, listening to, it was on NPR. Like, it's wild how wide open this thing. There was a story, because Bill Clinton had taken some flights, and on what was reported as the Lolita Express. And if you've read Nabokov, you know what that means. Underage pedophilia. and that was going to be a problem for Hillary Clinton, in 2008. And then in 2016, there's kind of like a weird thing where it didn't come up because Hillary and Trump were both implicated. I haven't looked into the recent, I guess there was unsealing of documents and Trump is named as a Jane Doe. I would not be surprised if Trump procured services with Epstein, like a lot of rich people did. Like I think Bill Clinton also did. He would not be the first president, I suspect, of having partaken in what I think, if this is as bad as it looks, which I think it certainly looks bad and should be fully investigated by law enforcement. But it's also, as Alex Acosta, former Trump cabinet member, said when he was in Florida, we're not going to look into this because it's intelligence related. But yeah, you could do some investigate. Like, first of all, yeah, you're in Congress, you stupid motherfucker. Like, use that power to look into this. The press can only frankly go so far, and the mainstream media is lousy with intelligence themselves, so they're not going to go into it too deeply. So, I mean, is it true that the media isn't covering Trump? Well, they're also not covering like accusations against Joe Biden.
Yeah.
It has a pretty selective attention span.
It's just like we've had 8 years. Like, is this really where y'all are at right now in the Democratic Party? We have had 8+ years of just Donald Trump, news stories, scandals, investigations, whistleblowers, everything for years and years and years and years. And he sucked.
And what do they have to? And what do they have to say? It's 34 felonies. 34 felonies related to that. I think. Look, lock him up. But you balance that out next to Joe Biden, what he's doing in Palestine. I'm sorry, it just pales. It fucking pales. And you stack up even what he did as a president. And look, massively ramped up the drone war from Obama. Assassinated world leaders. Like, not good either. But what Joe Biden is doing is a fucking genocide. It is not just a run-of-the-mill shit. It's just like, yeah, you got him on some felonies. And you know what? You're right. Like, I agree with folks that said, actually, that's not the severe crime that he committed. The actual, like, trying to overturn an election. I would love to see him go to fucking jail for that. I think, like, countries that do that, when people try to do coups, those countries are righteous. But Joe Biden should also be locked up.
No, I mean, look,
or put into a home.
The fact is that they have had years to make the case about how bad of a guy Donald Trump is and why you should oppose him, right? It's very clearly they've run out of runway for this. If you looked, I think it was the YouGov poll today, Matt. We're looking at a significant plurality of American voters who said that they would vote for Biden, right, in this race if he makes it. We're saying they were doing it to vote against Donald Trump. So you have already sort of made and exhausted this kind of case. And this is where it gets you, where a former reality TV star with scandal after scandal, with liability after liability, is going to beat the sitting president of the United States because the Democratic Party is too unimaginative, too rotten to its core to even be able to put up a viable candidate against, yes, a very, very bad and wicked man. And the Democratic Party is much more interested, as we have seen time and time again, in squashing any kind of political alternative from existing within itself, or hell, even in trying to block third-party movements from being able to gain steam in this country as well, right? Because the Democratic Party is an absolutely fundamentally rotten husk. And to sit here in a moment like this and to not take advantage of the position and the capacity that some of these progressives do have to come and make an alternate case against this rotten system is a complete dereliction of the entire theory of politics that those folks were elected on in the first place. And you know what happens when all of your arguments about democracy are negative What I mean by that is, we have to save democracy. Don't vote for something. You have to vote to prevent something. Well, eventually that democracy is going to wither on the goddamn vine, because you have no capacity to mobilize or get people to show up in crisis moments. And you get political leadership of people like Joe Biden, who can't even selfishly do politics, right? I'm not even talking about doing the things that I might want somebody to do in power. Just can't even run the U.S. government competently enough without engaging in massive genocides, and without engaging in, in one of the most embarrassing final chapters, I think, of any U.S. president at this point, which is what this next few months of the Joe Biden administration are going to be. I don't know. This is just, what is it here that we're doing? What is the thing that we're supposed to be fighting for? It's completely a mystery to me. Defend democracy against Donald Trump so that we can watch more rich, corrupt guys die in office. I don't know. It's not real.
Yeah. So the director of national intelligence can say we're Iran bots. Yeah. We should just play this before we move on. But this answer to this question should go down in the annals of history as one of the most disqualifying for somebody running for high office, let alone the fucking president. But he's asked, with all of this shit we hear about Project 2025, and look, I don't think it pays to downplay plans like that. But I will just say,
I do. We can have that conversation later.
It's even starker. Like I think the Republicans have a bad intentions with the judiciary, right? But like what really is in stark relief is that there is no affirmative agenda for the Democrats. There should be a Project 2025 from the left of what we do when we are in power. And Joe Biden, instead, he's like, well, maybe we'll get to the Iran deal. Maybe. And because it's all about running the clock out of any sort of actual mandate for progress. But, here's this clip here. Joe Biden asked by George. This was supposed to be the interview where
I couldn't believe this.
He brings it all back.
They put this, they put this out. I'm sorry, Matt. What time they put this out? They put this out at Friday night at like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. on the July 4th weekend. That's not really a slot that you put something like this in if you want a lot of people to see it.
Yeah, this is the big return.
And if you stay in and Trump is elected and everything you're warning about comes to pass, how will you feel in January?
I feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. That's what this is about. Look, George, think of it this way. You've heard me say this before. I think the United States and the world is at an inflection point where the things that happen in the next several years are going to determine what the next 6-7 decades look like. And who's going to be able to hold NATO together like me? Who's going to be able to be in a position where I'm able to keep the Pacific Basin in a position where we're at least checkmating China now? Who's going to do that? Who has that reach? Who knows all these? We're going to have, I guess, a good way to judge me is you're going to have now the NATO conference here in the United States next week. Come listen. See what they say.
I mean, I guess I've sort of answered my question of why this won't go down in history because it's too fucking confusing and convoluted. You're gonna read that in a history book. You're like, oh, what is he saying?
Come to the NATO conference where we can talk about making the world less secure.
God,
insane. Yeah, I mean,
I'm trying to look. There's Rob Delaney had a good tweet recently, but I've been too active on Twitter. But he had a good Biden. Just had a very brief but illuminating conversation with President Biden, whom I support fully. He told me as a kid in Scranton, he used to, here's the deal. You take an old tire and fill it with soup. Listen, 10, 20 people in one car. You better believe it. Pepperidge Farm.
Oh, my Lord. Well, this has gone on, too long, and we got to jump to these other conversations. I will just say in closing, beyond not being inspired by this party, or particularly optimistic about the future of this country. I think one thing that is really, really damaging for all of these folks who, again, are supposed to sort of represent a political alternative to this party, who are doing everything that they can to cover for him, is that this involves lying to the American people here. Not just trying to push a bad solution or a bad strategy on folks. This involves lying. If you say that person who you just watched in that interview, you saw at that debate, or we saw 2 years ago when he couldn't make critical meetings because he had to go to bed, is capable and has the capacity to be the president of the United States, you are lying to yourself and you're lying to the country. And it's those kind of things that sort of make it impossible and for people to trust these kind of movements. And they certainly make people even more and more cynical, which, understandable and justifiable reaction to the world that we live in, but it certainly doesn't help us get to where we need to be. And just these folks are participating in that, and I think that is kind of unacceptable at this point.
Yep, it's a big shame.
All right, folks, we're going to go to the United Kingdom where we have mixed news. It was really great talking to Philip Cunliffe.
Yeah. I do kind of want to note, though, I was worried about our boy Jeremy Corbyn because he's booted out of Labour and had to run as an independent. He won in, I think, a very inspiring way. And I think that, look, if AOC's thinking that she's going to run for Senate, I think that is, good luck. I think it's very possible that to the extent that any of these people remain in politics, they're going to be chased out of a party for the exact same reason Jeremy Corbyn and his wing of the party was chased out. Mm-hmm. So I think it's maybe something to look to and prepare for, but I'm a bit morbid these days, I guess.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the sunshine. Well, folks, we'll jump to this, and then some interesting news out of Iran too. Very happy to talk with Seamus, so stick around for that. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David Griscom here, and I'm very thrilled to be joined by Philip Cunliffe. Philip, you might know him from the Bungacast, one of my personal favorite shows, but he does many other things. Phil, actually, before we jump in, do you want to give our audience a little introduction, tell them about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be on. So as you mentioned, David, I'm one of the co-hosts of the Bungacast podcast. Been doing that for quite a few years now. And I'm an associate professor at UCL in International Relations in the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction, and have written a number of books, most recently the book Taking Control, Sovereignty and Democracy After Brexit. That was co-authored with some of my collaborators around Brexit, which is to say Lee Jones, Peter Ramsey and George Hoare, people I've worked with or written with, and some of those names might be familiar also to listeners of the pod as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of ways, I mean, bring up Brexit there, and we're getting into a very, I don't know, interesting might seem like the wrong word here, but a kind of consequential moment in UK politics. And for people who listen to this program, we had Jean Bagelon on to talk about some of those immediate results. But I wanted to bring Philip on here to talk a little bit more in depth. And I mean, maybe just to start, could you give your general sense, for somebody who may have a general sense that Labour won? I mean, what happened over this July 4th election in the UK?
Yeah, so Labour's won a remarkable parliamentary majority, so a huge number of seats on a very low number of votes in terms of a proportion of eligible voters, but also in terms of their own previous votes. There's been kind of a staggered drop in terms of vote share. So the famous, or one of the kind of big headlines of the election has been the fact that Keir Starmer has won on fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn lost on, both in 2019, which was a nadir for the Labour Party, and also 2017, the two past elections when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. So for such a kind of momentous parliamentary victory for the Labour Party, it also, as well as some other kind of remarkable breakthroughs for other political parties and independents into Parliament, it's a remarkable non-event. Kind of passed by fairly smoothly. As you'd expect, kind of lots of the kind of frothy chatter on social media, and some, hysterical headlines in some of the kind of newspapers. But really, it's not something that you really felt in terms of ordinary overhearing people on the street talking to friends and family, ordinary chatter back and forth that you might kind of just chat about with acquaintances or strangers. It's something that kind of passed by without much public engagement, I think. And that's borne out both by the low vote share and the kind of general lack of enthusiasm for any political party throughout the election. So it's a very different feel to the last few elections, for sure. There's a general kind of mood, I think, of resignation, not quite apathy, but I'd say resentment and suspicion. So I think underlying some people's positive feels about, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who are glad to see the back of a dreadful Tory government, but I think there's probably more people who feel deeply suspicious and also filled with misgivings about the future. And it seems to me that beneath the surface, the mood is actually quite ugly and febrile.
And I think that this is an interesting thing to sort of jump into. I mean, what is your kind of take on the role that Reform played? Because when you look at kind of the vote share of apart from just like low turnout, it doesn't seem as commanding. And actually, if you could also explain to our audience too, who might not be familiar how like the UK system works, it doesn't seem as commanding as a victory as some of the headlines that we've seen for Labour. Yeah.
So it's a first past the post parliamentary system. So the government is formed directly from elected parliamentarians, or the Prime Minister appoints, but generally the cabinet and the government is formed from people who win their constituents' seats in Parliament. So beyond that, I mean, the reason doesn't seem such a dramatic, or it's not such a kind of dramatic victory, is because there's been relentless attention drawn to the fact of an enormous discrepancy between how much Labour has won in terms of parliamentary seats versus how many people actually turned out to vote for Labour. So they've won about a fifth, perhaps, of all eligible voters. And as I mentioned, they've won on a kind of a vote share that's actually less than the number of votes that Jeremy Corbyn won. And there were many problems with, Jeremy Corbyn's campaigns, not least the fact, he lost. And so the fact that they've won in that context indicates, I think, just how, this is Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, is genuinely a giant with feet of clay. So he confronts a very kind of fragmented and divided opposition. The Tories have been beaten down. They've lost about 200 seats. They've been beaten down to 120 seats. There's the entry of, Labour won 218 seats, which is a truly, remarkable kind of parliamentary win. The Liberal Democrats, who are kind of fairly clownish, kind of milquetoast centrists, as the name suggests. They've done significantly better. They've won 64 seats. Another turn-up for the books is the Scottish National Party, which is, if you think of kind of a technocrat, kind of basically... if you think about the Labour Party, with all kind of pretensions and institutional legacies and history of any kind of Labour activism or organisation or claim to support the working class, if you think of the Labour Party with all of that removed, that's basically the Scottish National Party. They've lost 40 seats. They've been beaten down to 9 seats, which indicates that the union of Scotland and England is secure, which again is kind of unexpected, because if you went back a few years ago, everyone thought the result of Brexit meant that the union was on the rocks and was in danger of disintegration. And then you have independents winning. So Reform, the party you mentioned, have taken seats from the Conservatives, and they've won 5 seats in Parliament, and that's Nigel Farage's party. And then also the Greens have made some historic gains. They've won 4 seats. They previously had 1 seat in Parliament. And then you have a kind of a clutch of independents, about 5 independents who stood against Labour on so-called pro-Gaza platforms, which is to say that was the kind of headlines of opposing Labour's position on foreign policy and on the war in Gaza. And they stood on those platforms, and they managed to win about 5 seats, as well as coming close to ousting some Labour so-called big beasts in a few constituencies. So I hope that gives a kind of a rough picture of the parliamentary result, at least in terms of seat numbers.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's very helpful. Well, I mean, let's talk about these guys for a little bit. Labour. It's been a kind of slow disaster watching the Starmer era. Any kind of hope that people had of kind of new politics coming from Corbyn seems to be completely gone. It's been interesting to see characters like Paul Mason continue to use phrases like building socialism and things like that. In the U.S., we use the term class de-alignment a lot to sort of describe what's happened with the major, the Democratic Party here, which traditionally got a large share of working class voters. Under Starmer, how would you sort of categorize the Labour Party, particularly its social base? Because it's been quite dramatic for me from the outside looking in, seeing what the Labour Party sort of represents now versus what its name sort of implies.
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, the Labour Party, the class de-alignment is very much and very similar, I think, in the UK as it is in the US, notwithstanding the difference between the electoral systems and the structure of the British state versus the American state. But the broad trends are all there. The same way the Democrats, I think, are more kind of a party of campus than they are of the shop floor or the trade union, or even, kind of the trade union bureaucracy. The same could be said of the Labour Party. They're no longer could be meaningfully described as a party of organised, of trade unions and the organised labour movement, not least because the organised labour movement is so weak. Britain has enjoyed something of an upsurge in labour militancy since Brexit over the last few years. And, that's not insignificant, but still it's coming from, it's kind of a weak heartbeat after what appeared to be a long-term or a long death, so it's certainly not kind of surging forward. And in so much as there is a connection to labour unions, to organised labour, a lot of it is white-collar unions who are in the public sector or, kind of adjacent to the public sector in one way or another. And so these are people who are very much, particularly the leadership of those unions is still very much, white-collar, middle-class professionals, the liberal professions and so on. And that is the core of the Labour Party base. And indeed borne out by some of the results that have come through, because the kind of historic heartlands of the Labour Party, which was the so-called Red Wall constituencies, which is the belt of constituencies running from roughly the northeast and Newcastle through to Liverpool and Manchester on the west coast. So kind of that belt of swathe of old industrial districts between the port cities of England's east and west coasts. That was the so-called Red Belt, and that it's in that area that Labour lost in 2019 and how the Tories got in. And it's how the Tories lost this time round as well. So those used to be kind of one-party statelets. Those constituencies were solidly Labour up until 2019. They became swing states with the 2019 election. Not unlike, I suppose, the kind of Midwest voters who went from Obama to Trump over the last few elections in the US. And these swing states have now swung back behind Labour and given enough of them either their votes were split between Tory and Reform for it to go back to Labour, or they swung back decisively to Labour. So the Labour, it's not working class people obviously still vote for the Labour Party, but in terms of its core solid base, in terms of its reliable power base electorally, sociologically, institutionally, politically, the people who count, the people who shape opinions. It's all I'd say it's mainly boomers and millennials in generational terms, and also the professional service, overwhelmingly the professional kind of managerial class, PMC, in terms of a kind of a sociological composition of the Labour Party itself.
I mean, how much of a factor was the kind of betrayal by the Labour Party on Brexit to that reconstitution?
Significant, I think, in two respects. So in one respect, in that it seems, so the Reform Farage's political party have made the case with some justice that they are now the opposition to the Labour Party, because even though they've won a very low number of seats, they won they kind of won roughly, if not more, the same number of absolute votes as the Liberal Democrats. So Liberal Democrats have got 72 seats and Reform have 5 seats, and they won roughly the same number of votes in the country. So that indicates that the first past the post system is seriously kind of distorting the public's political expression. But in terms of Brexit betrayal, in those red wall constituencies, you have Reform either coming very close to those seats where the Labour Party won, or Reform damaged the Tory vote enough. They took enough votes away from the Tories that the Labour Party managed to get in. And if you wanted kind of one headline for this general election, you could say that Reform took away enough votes from the Tories that Labour managed to get in. It's a collapse of the Tory vote rather than a surge forth for Labour. And that reflects, I think, Labour's position to Brexit in two ways. The disappointment in red wall constituencies with the Tories, so that they kind of swung against the Tories, and the unwillingness to back Labour because some of them went to Reform, which is significant in itself. And on the other side, I think significantly the Green Party and the surge in independents, including Jeremy Corbyn is among them, because Jeremy Corbyn was barred from standing for the Labour Party, and he managed to cling to his seat just about because he faced the full force of the Labour machine without any real machine of his own. He failed really to build up a power base in his own constituency, so he clung on by the skin of his teeth, as it were, in his North London constituency. So I think on the other side, you've had a peel away of the kind of radical fringe of the Labour Party. And so even some notable figures such as Grace Blakeley, who's associated with Novara Media, or Owen Jones, kind of a leading leftist commentator, both of them have left the Labour Party and have been bigging up Greens and independents. And I think that indicates a degree of deep disenchantment with Starmer, which is partly the result of the failures of the Labour Party to manage the Brexit vote, to allow themselves to be manoeuvred into a position where Starmer managed to pull the Labour Party back from Brexit while also ousting Jeremy Corbyn at the same time. So there are many features of this election which still indicate the long, you can still see the long shadow of Brexit still looming over many of the kind of decisions and political manoeuvres taken by various parties and leading political figures.
Yeah, I mean, truly, and it's been, Brexit is one of those things that I think in the U.S., I'll just make a note to the audience here. I think in the U.S., people on the left have just no conception of what that has sort of caused. The betrayal of working class voters in the United Kingdom by the Labour Party on this. I don't think people really recognize how significant it was, because I think a lot of Americans still think that Brexit was, do we want nice fast passport checkout lines and, to be cosmopolitan versus like a mean, nasty kind of racist thing, instead of, the fight is about pushing back on these really unaccountable institutions.
No, absolutely. Brexit has always, I think, suffered by being mentioned in the same breath as Trump, as the two kind of big populist eruptions in 2016. But they're very different things, not least by the fact that Brexit was a constitutional question that was cut across party lines. As I indicated, it kind of completely scrambled Britain's electoral geography. And it wasn't associated with a single, there were charismatic figures who campaigned for it, not least Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, but it was larger than either of them, and it's kind of the questions posed by Brexit had lasted their kind of political moment in that period as well. So it's something which was much, it was kind of a basic question of it was a basic constitutional question of the status of the country at large, and one that was not easily contained by any charismatic leader or populist party, and it continued simply to kind of royal British politics, and I think it still is. And so it was very much it was the most class correlated vote Britain has ever had. You can see in terms of vote share, it was kind of ever since 1997 when Tony Blair and New Labour went in, it kind of spikes at around 77% of in terms of the proportion of people voting, of eligible voters, and then just declines steadily till you get a spike again around Brexit, 72%, and then it kind of continues downwards. And this most recent election, a truly dismal kind of turnout, and in some constituencies even something like 50% turnout on a general election.
Well, in the US that'd be very good, but
well, yeah. So it's relative, but I think it's important, that it's important that people understand this wasn't, kind of just this kind of populist kind of sloganeering and crudity and crassness, and kind of it was a genuine constitutional question that many people took very seriously, including people who hadn't, nearly 2 million people who hadn't voted before 2016, including working class people. My abiding memory of 2016 is normally when I tell people that I'm a political scientist, kind of it just kills conversation dead. But 2016, people were constantly kind of, taxis, the guy who cut my hair, waiters, kind of even in trains, people would suddenly want to have a conversation about politics and want to know what you thought about it. So my abiding memory of that period was a very serious and sustained engagement by the public that I have never seen before or since in my adult life in Britain. And so the fact that so much of that seems to have been of that kind of energy and interest and commitment to public life and to political decision making collectively, that so much of that seems to have been spent, I think speaks to that deep sense of disappointment and bitterness that you see in the broad disinterest of the British public in this election.
Mm-hmm. Well, talking about that, we got a new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. I mean, what can we sort of expect from a Starmer, government over the next few months to years?
Yeah, so not very much is the short answer. They have oriented themselves around a kind of technocratic revitalization. So they've brought in some non-political figures to oversee certain things, which they claim are kind of flagship kind of aspects for them. They've cast themselves as a mission-led government. So there's things like house building, Britain's energy, smashing the migrant smuggling gangs around illegal migration, and Keir Starmer's promised to kind of chair commissions dedicated to all of this. So there's a very strong technocratic thrust to the way in which the government is presenting itself. The reason it will struggle is because the fracturing and fragmentation of the British state as a result of 40 years of neoliberalism mean there's very few levers they actually have to pull. So many basic public capacities and public powers are outsourced to various kind of independent or arm's length public bodies or agencies, or indeed just the kind of privatization of the energy markets of there's no real capacity to house build independently of private companies on the market. The transport infrastructure, the NHS, all of these things are kind of, if not outright privatized, they've been organized in such a way to have internal markets competing between different segments of those sectors. And so all of that makes it very difficult to actually deliver any kind of meaningful policy, particularly if you want to turn things around. And to give them kind of specific, concrete illustration, so two of the things they're intending to do, for instance, is as part of the broad trend towards reshoring and attempting to copy Bidenomics here in the UK, they've set up this idea of Great British Energy. So this idea of kind of making Britain's energy supply more secure. But it's not going to be a new kind of ministry responsible for building out capacity, supporting the grid and boosting it out and making us more energy independent. It's going to be a kind of like a quasi hedge fund, which is going to offer credits and tax relief to private providers in order to kind of boost the market. So it's that same, it's kind of retooling neoliberal regulatory governance. It's not really a kind of a meaningful change in terms of expanding state capacity or state building in any kind of meaningful way, or even really concentrating public power in the hands of elected ministers. All of that, I think, is still beyond their ken. And so that means, I think, that it will be they will find it very difficult to deliver even on their very modest offer to the electorate.
It was funny. I don't know if this was pre or post election, but I saw a clip of Tony Blair just gushing about artificial intelligence and how the future is here, and it really did feel like a kind of obviously the context AI being new, but it did feel like a kind of throwback to somebody talking about, oh man, .com, we got internet now, all this kind of stuff. Is this a return to kind of new labor, to neoliberalism? I mean, is this little blip that we saw, I know you all talk about this on Bunga, we talk about this on this program. It feels very odd right now. We went through, kind of Bernie Sanders, left populist things, Jeremy Corbyn, all the examples, we all know them well enough. And it really does feel like there's a kind of a return to a previous form of politics. Do you think that's a correct way to look at the Starmer coalition coming into power?
Yeah, so certainly kind of, he's gone to kiss the ring. He's made very public shows of that, Keir Starmer, with respect to Tony Blair. Tony Blair is no doubt kind of tremendously influential on the Labour Party. At the same time, I think, the AI thing in particular, it indicates that idea that Labour is a project of technocratic modernization rather than redistribution or empowerment for the working class, or to even kind of meaningful kind of compression of inequality or dignity for the working class. That kind of Blairite vision that there is kind of technological solutionism to social pathologies and to deep political malaise, that is very much part of the Blairite era. It speaks to the lack of options available to Keir Starmer's government. So, I mean, one of the likely things that's to happen is, maybe not initially, but I think they will, try to kind of, because they've committed to the so-called fiscal rule, to avoid any kind of borrowing to raise taxes or to borrow more in order to pay for their agenda. They'll have to find other ways to raise revenue. And one of the ways in which they might do it is to sell NHS data to Peter Thiel's creepy, deep state, Silicon Valley hatchet thing, Palantir. So Palantir wants NHS data because it's one of the greatest kind of concentrations of private data in the world. Medical data associated with all sorts of variables that you would have that would be fantastic for AI. And the NHS needs money, and they're unwilling to borrow, and they're unwilling to kind of tax for it. And so it's a match made in heaven. So I think that is likely to happen at some point. Beyond that, is it a return? It isn't a return in the very basic way that there was genuine enthusiasm, I think, for Blairism, which I recall. I mean, I was young at the time. I was 18, 17, and I recall. So, my kind of memory of it is colored by that, but nonetheless, I think I can confidently say, there was a genuine enthusiasm for that vision of modern kind of globalized modernization that Blair was offering, in a way that it's a kind of an exhausted turn to Starmerism. You also had much stronger party alignment back in the early 90s and early 2000s. You had much more committed voters, whereas here we see a much more fragmented electorate who's aligned, like you say, kind of there's class de-alignment, political de-alignment, a much more volatile electorate, and with that, much greater political volatility and party fragility. So I think it's going to be more difficult to do that. The other big reason that there is a difference, I think, is also Brexit. For this reason is because Starmer is under tremendous political and public pressure in a way that he would not be were we still in the European Union. Because everything in the European Union is conducted through partnership among governments, kind of over the heads of their voters and their citizens, there's always the possibility of diffusing kind of public pressure or political pressure domestically by waiting for a ministerial meeting or waiting for a decision by the European Commission, these supranational and technocratic bodies that kind of disseminate policies downwards onto their member states. And so that was always a way to, it was always a safety valve for domestic politics, was to have that option. That option is now closed down. So it makes it, I think, the pressure on Keir Starmer to deliver in a situation in which he has very little political legitimacy and democratic mandate. He's always going to stand up in Parliament facing Jeremy Corbyn on the opposite seats, knowing that he won with fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn lost with. That's always going to, he's always going to feel that whenever he stands up in Parliament. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's not a return simply because they don't have the legitimacy for the project. So there's an attempt to kind of throw up technocracy again as a solution, but it just doesn't have the legitimacy to drive it forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. In the last couple of minutes, I was just hoping we could maybe talk about, if you're seeing any kind of like alternatives cooking up. I mean, I know a couple of years back, or damn, times moving so fast, maybe it was last year, the RMT strikes, there's a lot of excitement around folks like Eddie Dempsey and Mick Lynch. They created some organization that I don't think really went particularly far, if I recall correctly. But I mean, you saw Jeremy Corbyn being able to win. You see folks around like Novara supporting Greens to a certain extent. I mean, and I think that that's probably a kind of dead end politically, just to put my 2 cents on it. But I mean, is there any kind of opportunity, to build up something? If the dream of, capturing the Labour Party has been sort of, quashed for folks, is there a kind of hope of building up a kind of independent and working class movement that's able to operate on the political level?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the RMT, the Rail Maritime Transport Workers Union, so it's a working, it's definitely more of a working class union than the than the white collar kind of public sector unions I mentioned before. And it was also one of the kind of few big unions that came out in support of Brexit. It has a much kind of stronger socialist tradition in terms of its leadership and also just a working class leadership compared to many, kind of plenty of the other unions. Now, that said, the RMT kind of under the leadership of Bob Crow, the late kind of militant trade union leader they had, who is behind many of the strikes of the London Tube in the past, he tried to kind of distance the RMT from the Labour Party. And I remember Eddie Dempsey kind of reflecting on that at an event I spoke at and organised some years back. And he said, it didn't work out well for the RMT. And so Mick Lynch, the current kind of RMT leader, he's been very voluble in terms of his support for Keir Starmer. He says, let's be serious. We need to be in with the Labour Party. We have no choice. And so we have to get Starmer into government. And I suppose, they're... As some of the privatized contracts expire now, they're going to be taken. The private sector railway companies some of them are going to be taken back under public ownership, and I expect the RMT is kind of hoping to benefit from that. But there is they were burned by their experience to kind of be politically independent of the Labour Party in a different context, and so they kind of pulled, they recoiled from that. Unfortunately, perhaps because I think the context is more propitious for independent kind of politically independent working class organizations now than it was back in the day. Some of the trade union leaders, they do a dance. They're more willing, the dance by which they kind of dance away from the Labour Party before they dance back to it. They'll kind of go away further. They'll take a few further steps away in a bid to kind of extract more concessions from the Labour Party leadership. So if you measure it by the distance they take before they return, maybe that's a sign of kind of an increasingly restive membership, a willingness to take risks, a willingness to hold the Labour Party leadership more accountable. But it's small, really, it's small pickings. What I would say is, so Reform, the Farageist political party that's made a breakthrough in Parliament, it's modelled itself on the Canadian right-wing party that demolished the Canadian Tories in the early 90s. And if Farage is to be believed, he's ruthlessly committed to either destroying or taking over the Tory party. I think Navarra, Owen Jones, the Greens, and the people voting for them, they're in the position that Farage was in back in 2019, when he was kind of a pressure group on the Tory party, and he cut a deal with them. He stood down his candidates, so they didn't face Tories in the 2019 election, and so the Tories stitched up that election and thrust Boris Johnson to his tremendous win in 2019 against Jeremy Corbyn. And now Farage says they're not doing that anymore. Right? So I think that is the position, like I say, the left is in the position Farage was in 2019. They're kind of on the outside. They want to be on the inside. They'll put pressure on from the outside, but it's kind of, there's no indication of a real political independence of the Labour Party. It's pressure from the outside and, radical gestures. More than anything else. So I don't see any real fragmentation. Unfortunately, there isn't as much fragmentation on the British left as there is on the British right.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I want to thank you so much for your time. Before we let you go, could you tell folks a little bit about Bunga and anything else that you're working on? I mean, I know y'all have expanded and brought on our good friend Lee Phillips into the team, which is wonderful.
Yeah, so Bunga's we've recently expanded, as you say. We brought on, particularly because we've got so many listeners in America, we thought it kind of behooved us to make sure we have more Americans on. And so we've got Catherine Liu, Amber Ali Frost, Alex Gorovich, as well as Lee Phillips as more permanent fixtures on the pod. And generally we publish, about, we've got different tiers for our members, but it's about 6 episodes every month of different kinds. We've got a reading club. We've got regular chat and commentary on political goings-on, including all the big elections that are happening around the world at the moment. And we'll have plenty coming up on the US election as well, no doubt. But generally it's the Global Politics podcast at the end of history. At the moment, I'm working on what liberalism looks like in terms of my kind of my intellectual kind of work, academic scholarly work is looking at how liberalism evolves in the aftermath of unipolarity. That's the thing that's kind of interesting me the most at the moment and what I'm trying to write about. So if anyone's interested among the listeners, they can by all means feel free to get in touch or to chase me up on it.
Well, hell yeah. We'll really appreciate it, and we'll put links to everything below there. Thanks so much for your time, friend.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Reckoners, David here, and I'm very thrilled, as always, to be joined by our friend Seamus Malekafzali. How you doing, friend?
I'm doing all right. Happy to be back.
Yeah, man, I'm really happy you're joining us from Beirut. We had you on the program pretty recently to talk about, Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. But there's an update here after President Raisi passed away after his helicopter crashed into a mountain. There is now a new president in Iran. Could you tell us about this second round of elections and who won here?
So unlike how it is in America, it's constitutionally mandated in Iran for there to be another presidential election around 50 or so days after the previous president either resigns or dies. So this was set into motion very quickly afterward, and to many people's surprise, there was a major reformist candidate, Masoud Pezeshkian, who was allowed to run in that election. And what surprised even more people is that he was able to beat back not only 5 conservative candidates to get to the second round, but he won the election pretty decisively with the majority of the vote. So he is going to be inaugurated in August on a platform that primarily focuses on re-engaging with the West on things like nuclear negotiations and aligning with international financial protocols and so on and so forth, as well as ending the mandate of the guidance patrol, or the morality police that is in charge of enforcing mandatory hijab, which was something that embroiled the country in nationwide protests back in 2022. So this is not someone who would be considered radical by like American standards. Obviously, this is not a leftist by any stretch of the imagination. Every single person who runs in Iranian elections who is authorized by the Guardian Council is some variety of right-wing Islamist. But this is about as radical, I would say, that the Iranian political system would allow, and it caused a pretty huge stir.
I mean, it was a pretty interesting campaign. I mean, I believe it was you. This was maybe a few weeks back, but he was doing like kind of town halls with like young folks in Iran, correct? Where he was sort of taking some kind of pointed questions. I mean, it felt like there was a little bit of a kind of opening in an election where a lot of people thought that there would just be a kind of very general closed ranks of more conservative far right candidates or regime adjacent candidates.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I think when the Guardian Council authorized Pezeshkian, I think there was an assumption that it would work like other elections, and there's a reformist in the race, therefore turnout is going to explode, and therefore any concerns about the public legitimacy of the system will be assuaged. And in the first round, it was a disaster. It was the lowest turnout in the history of the Islamic Republic. But in the second round, the turnout increased by around 10%, putting it more or less in line with American elections, but still not great by the standards set by the government itself. No, I mean, when Iranian people saw that there was a chance at some level of change, even if it was a kind of change that was advertised by candidates before and wasn't exactly novel, a lot of people would want to jump at that. I think the idea that was pushed by the opposition abroad that, every single person who didn't vote was completely against the Islamic Republic and thought that voting was like, some sort of war crime and all these different things. That's a bit assumptive. If people see an opportunity for change, there's still a general sense of malaise at the idea of how little things change overall, but people still will jump at that if you are presented with that opportunity. But nevertheless, even though turnout jumped in the second round, I'm still of the opinion that the general trend shows that the Islamic Republic still faces a real bad crisis of legitimacy. Back in 2009, when Mir Hossein Mousavi ran with around the same platform that Pezeshkian did, turnout was, I want to say, 85%. Around that, that's completely unheard of for any American election. So when Pezeshkian, with the same platform, generally speaking, runs and only gets 49% turnout, that's better than what people had maybe assumed, but that's not a great sign.
Yeah, I mean, in a second, I sort of want to ask you about what you think may come of this. But just before that, he sort of has like an interesting, at least I was reading that he has an interesting relationship with Khomeini, who probably played a large role in him getting approved in the first place, because he seemed like one of the candidates a lot of people were sort of expecting to be axed. Is that a fair understanding here? Or like what, to the extent that you understand, is his relationship with Khomeini?
I'm not exactly sure of the exact details of the relationship with Khamenei, but I think I do know what you're referring to. Khamenei was the person who intervened on Pezeshkian's behalf. Not necessarily Pezeshkian himself, but last year before Raisi died, he had a discussion with the Guardian Council in which he had pointed criticisms of how restrictive they were with the disqualifications, and that it was the thing that was driving such a low turnout, and that there needed to be more space in any future election. And so when Raisi died, thus the election gets brought forward, and then Pezeshkian, someone who is a reformist but obviously is not going to buck the system, that is the kind of person that you would want to put in as that sort of olive branch. That being said, even though Khamenei paved the way for this person to be selected as a candidate, as an approved candidate, before the election took place in the first round, he had made criticisms, not by name, but telling candidates that they should not, I can't remember the exact wording, but essentially not to trust in America too much, to not pick people who trust in America, who align themselves with America. And that can really only describe one person's policy platform. The roadblocks that Pezeshkian is going to encounter, I think are still very much going to be there.
Yeah, and I mean, this is sort of, I mean, so two questions here is what, what can we sort of expect? And the second one, maybe just frame it for the American audience out here. When we say like reformist, what is reformable? What is touchable by these? Because again, these aren't radical governments or anything like that. So what do we mean when we say like reformers? What kind of part of the system here are they potentially going to be interested in tweaking?
Yeah, I mean, a reformist in the Iranian political sense is going to be somebody who advocates more of a liberalization of the system in terms of allowing more freedom of speech, freedom of the press, more rights for women. Occasionally, more engagement with the West, though the optimism for that, I think, is waning pretty considerably. Things that adjust the country in a more, I guess you could say, progressive direction, but I hesitate to use that descriptor. But absolutely nothing within that would constitute a direct threat to the Islamic Republic as like a religious system. I really want to emphasize that. This is the big contention that opposition people have with it, that they don't want to buck religious governance. Probably the most radical reformist major politician was, again, someone I mentioned earlier, Mousavi, who began his campaign in 2009 more conservative, became much more radical in his outlook as the campaign went on, and now, at this time, advocates a full referendum to change the governance system of the country. He's an outlier in this respect. Khatami, the former president, he didn't even vote in the last election. So there's space for, more opposition to the state, but not in a sense that it would disrupt the primary authority. But again, I just want to emphasize, Pezeshkian during the debates explicitly said that he was a conservative in his personal outlook and a reformist in his political outlook. So these are all very religious people. Khatami, the primary reformist, he is a scholar. Rouhani, a moderate who aligned himself with the reformists, he was also an Islamic scholar. These are people of faith. These are people of religion. They're not going to have progressive views on things like gay rights, for instance, or be friendly to socialism, as an ideology. But these are people who advocate some level of change.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. Last thing I want to ask you is, I mean, how significant, do you think that this victory is? I mean, what do we think is kind of possible in terms of like maybe geopolitics and particularly for Iranian folks? I know there's like definitely some hope that they, as you were mentioning earlier, that morality police stuff will be sort of scaled back a bit. But tell us, how significant you find this election to be.
I think it's very significant. I mean, this is the first reformist president since Khatami, so 20 years that Iran has not had one. This is a man who, he even if he is holding against what is going to be a conservative parliament, obviously a supreme leader who is not going to be in favor of all parts of his agenda, this is someone who is going to appoint people to his government that are going to be in favor of diplomacy and I think are going to take a very firm stand against the morality police within all the powers of the presidency, you can argue. I don't think that, at least in the near term, I can't foresee anything huge and major happening, like, within the first year. But the president absolutely has the ability to change the atmosphere of the country's administration. This is what it's always been. Even if, they're not the commander-in-chief of the army, even though they don't, appoint, the chief justice, for instance, those powers are delegated elsewhere. I mean, you cannot make the argument that Iran was no different under Ahmadinejad than it was under Rouhani when the nuclear deal happened. These are people who obviously have huge powers unilaterally on their own to change the direction of things. I think probably the thing that is most within his purview is stopping the operations of the morality police. That is something that he can probably affect on his own with people in his government. But outside of that, diplomacy with America is going to be very difficult. I think Biden, I don't think he's going to be interested in dealing with this, and Trump absolutely will not.
What's going on.
That's not going to happen. And I mean, this is the thing that was of, I think, some contention, even if I, broadly speaking, agreed with what Pezeshkian was selling. The America that existed in 2015 is absolutely not the America that's going to exist in 2025. Mm-hmm. I think negotiations, even if it's good to get the sanctions off, not only is it going to be probably impossible with America, it's also going to be a very difficult sell to Iranian conservatives. Because, like David, I'll ask you honestly. You're an Iranian nuclear official. You do literally everything in your power to abide by the strict regulations that America sets out for your own enrichment. And then Trump rips it up. And then for years afterward, you have to hold up your end of the bargain as your economy is destroyed. And then the president comes in new one and says, let's do this all over again and hope it works out better this time. That's, frankly speaking, that's
and
a
people
very
forget
difficult,
how intense those regulations were, and in a lot of ways, like consulting the inspections for their program were.
No, it was severe. It was really restrictive. I mean, people saw it as like an abdication of Iran's sovereignty as a country to develop its own nuclear power. And the result of Trump destroying that deal is that the Iranian people became more radical in what they want. I mean, previously, there would have been no discussion of a nuclear weapon in any serious area of the media, of power, of anything. When that's been suggested, it's been shot down, and it's been shot down hard. But now it's openly discussed, the idea that Iran needs a nuclear deterrent, that America can't be trusted, and it can't be trusted to the extent that Iran needs a nuclear weapon in order to make sure that America abides by its agreements. That's the state that Pezeshkian is going to have to contend with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a truly, truly devastating political reality. Seamus, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us on short notice. Could you just remind folks about where to go to keep up with all of your great work?
You can read my work at Seamus-Malekafzali.com. I have an article up about Pezeshkian from before the election that you can read there. and also something about Biden's Iran policy that was published about a week ago.
Well, wonderful. Folks, we'll put a link down below. And again, Seamus, thank you so much.
No problemo.
You know, not fair to say David lost a mustache competition.
No, I think it is fair to say that. That's a.
Well, I was like saying he missed a basketball competition, lost a basketball competition with LeBron.
I lost, and I shaved it this morning after the interview. No, it was. I have to say, first of all, both of our guests are very thrilled to have them on. So very much appreciate Seamus doing that on very short notice. So really appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens in both the United Kingdom and Iran. We'll be watching that very closely. Very thankful to both of our guests, Philip of Bungacast and Seamus. And we have links for their podcast, for Philip's podcast and for Seamus's excellent Substack below. People should definitely check them out and support both of those projects. Matt, I think we might need to jump over to the post game. We got a lot of fun stuff to get to. We're going to talk a little bit about France. Matt, did you know that that Biden is a black woman?
He is that bitch, Joe Biden.
We got a little bit more fun stuff, fun revelation.
We're going to get into ideas, take a little break from the horse race and look at what libertarians are talking about, which you'll be shocked is taking food out of people's mouths, which is their favorite thing to fucking do. So we're going to be going at some reason idiots.
Brilliant minds. Well, folks, you get access to that plus our bonus episodes at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. I mean, we've had some really juicy ones that folks, if you're just watching on the free side, you've been missing. We obviously had Gene Bajlan on the program to give us his instant take of the UK elections. We had our good friend Mike Prisner for a deep dive into Tulsi Gabbard, which I don't know if you saw, she had some very interesting takes on the election recently.
Tulsi recently, even since we talked with Mike.
Yes.
Oh, I did not see that. I mean, I've been missing. I canceled my Tulsi Google alert. But it was fascinating for folks who haven't heard that, like because we got in the question that I've really had about Tulsi, which is like, what the fuck is she doing? Like as a troop, she's a troop of some sort, and she's also anti-war, and she's going to project American military force. So it's an interesting dichotomy. And I don't know if there's anybody better in the world to talk about that than Mike Prisner.
100%. We also had Dino Guastella on the program recently too to talk about harm reduction and why liberals and leftists become such libertarians when it comes to drug policy. Dino is known to most everybody who watches this podcast for the past years as the cool mustache union guy. And people have been begging for us to get the cool mustache union guy back on the program for about 2.5 years. We finally did. So go over there, patreon.com/Left Reckoning, and get access and check all those great episodes out. Plus the post game immediately after the show.
We've got, and I actually just shaved mine very short right before this, but we have a veritable mustache roster forming.
We do, folks. So you want to come over there, come see the other side, come hang out with us. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Thanks everybody for making this another great week. See you soon.